This module is going to be really short because actually, if you think about it, most of this large part of this we've already covered. When you're looking at the relationship between the group and the individual, there's always a set of stress factors. The group always has a set of expectations. Within cultures, expectations are usually grounded in a collection of sort of shared values and attitudes, but they're almost always also from the past. Cultures are innately conservative. People grow up trying to teach their kids what they remembered when they were little. So cultures always have this dynamic. In fact, cultures always have a huge amount of stress between they're grounded or sort of embedded in the past, the shared collective idea of what the past was. But then, of course, they're also having to deal with the present and the potential future. And this means cultures are always, have got sort of built-in design stress, if you want to think of it that way. In that context, then, when you add the fact that individuals, even in a small family, are going to have different goals, attitudes, and desires based on the way that they interpret all this and what they want to do with their lives, if you want to call it that. That's when you start to get this sort of really fascinating dynamic that's a huge part of anthropology, which is the relationship with the group and the individual. Now, of course, if you want to look at it from the other way, from the relationship of the individual vis-a-vis the group, that gets you into social psychology. And a huge part of psychology is, of course, actually dealing with the relationship that people have with the pressures of having to follow normative rules and behaviors of a group. And so when anthropology is looking at it, we tend to look at it from the group sort of putting on the individual and how individuals deal and negotiate with that set of group sort of expectations. So the key here, the key word you want to get familiar with, and you've probably heard it a bunch, would be the word norm. Norm is a term we use in the behavioral sciences, which means the collective set of expectations. Now you have to remember, for most things, it's actually going to be a continuum. So if you think of the visual image, I always think of it be, for example, a rainbow. So I don't remember how the colors work, but if it goes from red, we'll say it goes from red to yellow. In between that, there's going to be red. It's going to segue into orange, and then it's going to segue into yellow. So if you say, where does the red stop and where does the orange start? Different people are going to have different ideas of that. But if you say, is there a red and yellow piece to it? They're going to probably be able to agree that, yeah, there's this continuum of color. Norms tend to be the same way. Norms very rarely are a single thing. They're a package that oftentimes varies depending on the situation and how the group sees that situation, maybe how important that situation is, and et cetera. So on one hand, for example, in American society, you could argue that it's important to follow the law, that following rules is a big part of what Americans are about. And that's why Americans love to sue each other if they're not following the rules. On the other hand, if you go driving on the freeway, you realize very quickly no one's following the rules. If you try to go the speed limit on the freeway, someone's going to probably rear end you in about 10 seconds. So in that situation, obviously, or from outside looking at American society, you'd be able to say that, okay, Americans are very, very big on following rules. That would be that orange to yellow continuum. But in different situations, what the rules are and how important it is to follow them is going to vary tremendously. In some situations, it might be pretty rigorous. In other situations, it might be, pretty sort of stretched. It might be subject to a lot of interpretation. So in some situations, people will give you no tolerance if you do something that breaches or sometimes doesn't follow the norms. In other situations, you might have a lot of tolerance in terms of, doing something vis-a-vis what the group says is the right thing to do. Now, you can frequently find this when you talk to folks in a group. They'll tell you, this is what you should do. And the minute someone tells you whatever their language is, the word should in English is an interesting word because it implies a range of possibilities, which is very different if you think about it. If you ask someone, they say, well, this is what you must do. Must and should are very different words in English about, for example, behaviors. Must implies that there's no tolerance, that you cannot or you must do this. Should means that, if you want to score the most points, you should do it this way, but there's also these other ways you can do it. And they're not necessarily wrong, but they're not as right. So it very much this idea of continuum. Very rarely in society will you see most stuff actually defined in the word must. If we go back to what we were talking about last time, incest would be a thing that's one of the must categories. You must not have, sexual relationships with X, or you must not marry X. On the other hand, if you think about it, even in American society, the word should would be very frequently used in the idea of endogamy, who you should marry. Because in American society, that's a really wide range of people. that are potential marriage partners, and your family would like this one the most, this not so much, and maybe, you know, if you're on the Bachelor show, this one the least or something like that. So in that context, there's different ways of looking at it. When you hear something in a society and someone uses the word must in terms of behavior, you must do this. One is, if you're in that society, you better make sure you follow it, because they probably got absolutely no latitude for someone saying, I don't know, I don't understand, or oh, I didn't realize it was that important. Secondly, is you see the word should, that tells you in that society, you're going to find variations or variable patterns of individual behavior. So you can visualize individuals as playing a game, Monopoly, or I don't care whether, you know, board game, whatever you want to call it, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever it might be. And in that situation, they're going to negotiate what they feel is in their own personal best interest that fits within the normative context of the society and the group that they operate in. And this is one reason why even within a particular group, even if it's a pretty small group, you're going to find a tremendous range of behavior, even in the same situation. And that's to be expected. And this is one of the reasons anthropologists get very suspicious when people start talking about the idea of developing social laws, or someone says, human beings do this all the time. And immediately an anthropologist can be thinking, oh, I bet you I can find an example. That doesn't happen. So this idea that where you make these sort of, you know, fixed generalities are something that really sort of, you know, anthropologists tend to roll their eyes at. Now, what you do find is in all societies, there's a demand from the group that individuals behave in some way, shape, or form to fit the group expectations, to fit the group norms. And they do this in two ways. They do this through positive and negative sanctions. And if you go back to what we've been watching the last couple of weeks in the videos, we had that InstaLive one, which is a rather clever one, which you guys pretty much all you guys just finished watching that. If you think about the Pleasantville one, that's a really fascinating example, given the fact that it's an artificial world, right? It's a digital world. And you've got those folks, you know, if you remember that one, which I've been getting the reaction paper, so people have just been watching, I guess, that you've got a very strong set of rules in terms of how people are supposed to operate. And yet what's fascinating about that is Second Life, by virtue of its definition, pretty much people can do anything they want. And the fact you've got adults acting as kids in family settings is a pretty good example of that. So what you find in Second Life in Pleasantville, and to be honest, I've never actually visited the place, I just like that documentary, is that there's probably a great deal of sanctions and normative structure to allow people to role play that you know, digital reality that many of you pointed out they obviously really want to be in seriously, and they're actually in many cases living it. Now, if you think about it, there's two ways to do that. Negative sanctions are where you basically punish someone because they don't follow the rules or they don't follow the norms. So I assume maybe in Second Life, I suppose one of the things you can do, since I'm sure this is a closed community, you could throw someone out. So even though they can get into Second Life, they can't come into Pleasantville. They're locked out of that town or that role-playing group or whatever it is. So that would be a negative sanction. If you think about it in a school situation, that's where you know, you piss the university off and they throw you out. That issue on the mainland where folks are partying in fraternities, for example, and getting thrown out of the campus because they're not following the social distancing rules. That's a negative sanction. And you have to remember the function of negative sanctions isn't so much to punish the individual, at least not most of the time. In most societies, the function of negative sanctions is to scare the crap out of everyone else so they don't break the rules. So in most societies, negative sanctions are something you want to do very publicly to scare everyone else, to remind them that they have to follow this rule or this set of rules. So you sort of put the head on the pike because you want everyone else to be afraid that could happen to them too. Now, the problem with the negative sanctions is that they tend to be very limited in their effectiveness. You know, classically, if you ever get involved in education, if you go into a classroom, say in the ultimate nightmare, you're a substitute teacher. So if the first thing you do when you go into a classroom, the kids are tearing the room apart, if you start jumping down people's throats and throwing them out of the classroom and doing this, the other thing, on the one hand, you'll probably get some result. But on the other hand, if you actually want any learning to take place 10 or 20 minutes down the road, you might have real problems with that because negative sanctions tend to reinforce the power of the group to dictate on the individual. They don't tend to encourage people to be part of something. They encourage people to be invisible so they don't get caught. So negative sanctions are actually really limited, of limited effectiveness. And you can see this if you look at the American judicial system, with especially recidivism, people that go back into doing something wrong that they've done wrong before they've gotten caught and punished for. If the punishment were actually effective, then theoretically they wouldn't do it again. But the fact that you find people repetitively doing the same things that they know and they've been told are wrong is a good example of how limited the value of negative sanctions are. And also, if you pick on one person, but for example, you don't make it public, then why is that sanction going to work? And this is a big issue, as some of you pointed out when you were looking at those social media discussions, especially the Insta-Lie one. But actually, and maybe also, if you think about it, if you haven't watched it, but go ahead and watch that. The catfishing one might be a real interesting example when you think about that lady's doing stuff that's wrong. And when you think about it, by the time that show's done, she's actually become sort of famous because she's now on national, on MTV nationally as someone who, is now people are going to remember who she was. So if all she wants to be is remembered, it could be that show actually had no negative consequences at all for her, even though she did something that people would say, at least in American society, was some level sort of ethically wrong. So there should be some negative punishment for it, which is another word for negative sanction. Positive sanctions, on the other hand, would be when you reinforce positive behavior. So if someone does what the group wants them to do, then you encourage that behavior. And again, but you want to make it public. So if you go back to when you guys were little monsters running around the first grade classroom or something like that, so you do something right, and the teacher sits there and puts a gold star, I don't know what the hell you guys used, but whatever they do, they put something next to your name, or they make some sort of noise about the fact that you did the right thing. And of course, probably half the class then hates your guts right there, because you look like you're sucking up to the teacher or something. But the other part of the group's going to go, wow, if I acted like her, maybe I'd score some points too. And that's what positive sanctions is. Positive sanctions are intended by the group to encourage the behavior they want people to do. Now, again, if you think about it, traditionally this would go back. If you go back, since it's not too far in the future, this would go to the idea of Christmas. Theoretically, remember that the stories that we love to scare kids with, that if you're a bad kid, you won't get any stuff for Christmas. If you're actually using positive and negative sanctions to judge behavior over a year, then at least in, especially in my family, when I was a kid, I would have probably never gotten a Christmas present because I was pretty good at not doing what I was supposed to do. So if anything, it'd be a really long list of negative things and a very short list of things that I did right. So if that were actually part of the, sort of you must type things in American society, there'd probably be a lot less Christmas presents going around. On the other hand, think of the message you send to kids when you sort of try to scare them a little bit. Oh, if you keep on behaving like this and beating up your sister, you're not going to get anything for Christmas. By the time the kid's like probably 4 or 5 years old, he realizes that bullshit. He's going to get stuff for Christmas anyways. So, he's going to whack it on his sister, or she's going to whack on him, who knows. So what you get there is the sanctions ineffective. Positive sanction, in the same way, a positive sanction would be very effective if it's ambiguous. Sorry, if you're a really good kid and your sister or your brother's a really bad kid, and you both get really good Christmas presents, then that doesn't exactly send you a really clear signal that doing the right thing gets you a reward, because someone that did the wrong thing got the same reward or maybe a better reward. So like, dude, how's that fair? So positive and negative sanctions are really interesting. Many societies are very good, relatively speaking, about keeping these fairly clear. American society, in my view, is one of the most muddied in terms of the use of positive and negative sanctions. And you can see this a lot with Black Lives Matter. You can see this with the whole COVID issue and mask. You could literally walk down the street and get 6 different people crapping on your parade for 6 different things. And they're talking almost at cross purposes. And that's very symptomatic of a society which has almost basically no clear agreement on what its norms should be. And that, of course, makes life very confusing for all the members of the group, because then they don't know. If you're not clear about the norms, then how are you going to be clear on how to act appropriately? And what are the positives and what are the negative sanctions? And who should decide if you get a positive or negative sanction? Now, if you think about this, because some of you brought this up, the classic example of this in many ways, at least in the 2020s, would be social media. You can post something on social media and 800 people can love it, and 800 people can absolutely hate it, and 800 people will just dish you for a week, and the 800 people like it might be gone in a second. At that point, you know, what is that as a positive or a negative? And even more importantly, given the fact that it's social media, you have a really hard time figuring out what the normative criteria was to judge your behavior. Was it American? Was it Chinese? Was it some sort of weird global normative thing? You know, what are those criteria? And this is one of the reasons I would argue that social media is such an emotional stress factor for many people, is they're presenting themselves in public, but it's not within the context of a clearly defined group with their shared norms. And that's just leaving yourself open for a mess, basically. One of the most spectacular forms of this, and we actually see a version of this here in the Pacific and in Polynesia, would be the idea of what are usually called blood feuds. Blood feuds, again, if you go back to, I don't know, last week or when I was talking about on the idea of clans and lineages. If you have the idea of a clan, a group of people who see themselves as a shared group, et cetera, and especially if they see other groups as being different, since they're not part of the clan. If one member of clan A starts giving a member of clan B attitude, and these two clans don't see themselves as being somehow related to each other, and so it's just starting to get into it, then what you're very frequently going to find in societies which have a very strong sense of clan is pretty soon their relatives are going to get drawn into it. So we'll say person A and person B start going at it. Person A gets beat up. Now person A is going to go home, and they could just could keep their mouth shut, and someone says, "Oh, what happened to you? I ran into the door." But instead, what they go is, "Oh, this guy wouldn't go beat me up, and he shouldn't have done that. And that was really nasty. And he's, it's not fair. And he blindsided me when I wasn't." It comes up all sorts of stories why it was wasn't his fault, even though he might have started the fight. Now B's going to go home and we'll say that B's just not saying much about it because they gave the other guy a licking, so I don't care. But all of a sudden, what's going to happen is a couple of days later, A and maybe one or two of his relatives are going to show up and beat the bejesus out of B. To make up for the fact that B beat up A. Why? Because this group sees itself as unique and that they don't see this group as being relevant. So therefore, if someone does, they're picking on the group. If your identity is family and group first, then you're gonna pay very little attention to the fact that maybe person A is really sort of a jerk and actually started the whole thing. But they're part of your group, so that's where it stops as far as you're concerned. Doesn't matter how right B was to actually do whatever they did. They're not part of your group, therefore they have to be taught a lesson, and wham, you go on them. Now, of course, this group being what they are, they're not going to take that line down. So the next thing you know is they're going to get together and go after someone here. Now, where it gets really terrifying about this, and this is very typical with blood feuds, is that you don't have to go after the person that started it. You might find someone's 7-year-old cousin who's walking down the street to go to 7-Eleven. And the guys in this group think, well, hey, he's part of this group. Let's beat the crap out of him. Lump. And then these guys are going to say, well, here's, so-and-so's, niece. Let's go beat her up. And what you're also going to get is escalation, because everyone's going to think that their side was right, the other side was wrong. So whatever these guys do, you can't just pay them back. You have to pay them back with interest. And these guys, if they get beat up, are going to think we got to pay them back with interest. And this whole thing pretty soon escalates, and pretty soon people start dying. Well, that's blood feuds. These are common in an enormous number of societies. And in some cases, they last for a really long time. Sicily is probably one of the most famous. Sicilian families are very much clans. There's Sicilian blood feuds that have been going on for 500 years, which means if you're one of those families, you better be really carefully sure when you're walking down the street just exactly who else is on that street. Because you might get whacked or run over or hit or beat up for something that happened 300 years ago. Because that family still wants, and this is why they have the word vendetta. Okay, that's tied to blood feud. So go back and watch your old, mafiosi movies or something, or shows or something like that. You'll see this. That's sort of the mechanism behind it. It's not individuals or nuclear families going after each other. It's this idea of the group, and the only group, and that group's the only real group. Anyone outside of it has to be sort of like taught a lesson. Now, one of the places that was the worst in this was Scandinavia. Scandinavian societies were all totally clan-based, and basically had no tolerance for anything, and anything you did immediately had to be upscaled in return. So they always paid back with investment or with interest. Now, there's the things what you find is by about, 500, 600, 700 AD in Scandinavian societies, especially in the Danes in Denmark, what's now Denmark, is the Danes come up with the idea of weregild, which is sort of intriguing. In the Danish system, what happens is the guys in charge realize that basically the whole society is tearing itself apart. You know, literally people would walk into a building and before they could do anything, their just head gets chopped off because someone realized that's so-and-so's second cousin. Boom, that's it. Then of course, then they have to go over, you know, just see where this just goes nuts really quickly. So in that situation, what you find is the rulers or the guys in charge come up with the idea of what's usually called blood money. And that's what weregild means. Were meaning blood, and then guild meaning guilt, as in money. So they come up with a situation where, and this goes back to the idea of norms. Because if you think about blood feuds aren't necessarily norms. They're norm within the group, within the family. But in a larger community, they might be absolutely destructive and totally against the idea of the norm, which might be don't take human life, da 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 da. So in Danish society, what they came up with is the idea that if, for example, I pick on someone and injure them severely, so that family wants to come after me and my family, the guys in charge say, hold it, you know, time out, you guys can't do that. What we're going to do is we're going to find Bordner and his family, you know, 10,000 gold whatevers, okay, for doing this. And that money, part of that money stays with the guys in charge. Part of that money is given to that guy I beat up, his family. Now, what they tell that family is, okay, if my family pays the money, so we pay them the money. At that point, that's the end of this whole thing. Okay. Now, we'll say that some member of that other family isn't willing to accept that. He still feels that, you know, Bordner got away with crap and you got to teach him a lesson. So he and one or two of his buddies come after and whack one of my family. Now, because he broke the weregild, he broke the fact that the guys in charge had said, okay, once the money's paid, this thing is now powerless. It's finished. It ain't happening no more. Since he broke that, what they'll now do is they'll take the money that they took off the cut that they got from my family. They'll now bring that up and basically post that. And what they'll do is that post that anyone who kills that guy or any member of his family will get a chunk of that money. So what that means is, on one hand, he might talk up a story he's going to come after my family. But if his family's smart, this frequently happened in Denmark or in the Danish society, if it looks like he's actually going to do it, someone else in his family go and whack his ass right there. We'll just kill him. Because they realize if he actually goes through with what he's going to do, the whole family will basically be outlawed. And that's what the term comes from. I can't remember what the term is, udelaw or something like that in Danish. And that's what it meant. It's someone that broke weregild. And at that point, anyone in Denmark can sneak up on you, cut your throat, do whatever to you at any time of day or night, and they get the money. So it was the Danish way, or oftentimes it's usually called the Vikings. It was the Danish way of dealing with blood feuds that went on forever. Now, many societies, like in Sicily, they don't have weregild. They don't have an overarching political social structure which gives you that type of enforcement ability. But it's real interesting that in Scandinavia, you find that weregild was the normal procedure. And there were a ton of people that got caught in that. There's the real famous explorer, Eric the Red, I think his name was. I don't know, I forget. But including the guys that went down and became the mercenaries working for the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. They were all guys that broke weregild. And what they had is that means they had to get their butt out of town because anyone in the country can catch them, kill them, and they get the money. No questions asked. And there's nothing their family can do to protect them because all the family is basically now outlawed. So the only way the family's got to make sure they don't all die is to basically then disavow that person, say they're not part of this family anymore. So therefore, go and kill them, feel free, but we had nothing to do with it. Real fascinating way that a group deals with basically a persistent, ever-escalating pattern of violence is to basically put a big foot right in the middle of it with weregild. Real fascinating way to do that. The last part of this is pretty straightforward. Conflict resolution. You guys should probably be familiar with this. I would assume that somewhere in your academic career, maybe in grade school or high school, maybe they brought this up, but I don't know. I mean, when I've been talking to the other Zoom classes, it turns out that I'm not really too sure what you guys are getting in grade school, or especially in high school. So we'll assume that you haven't heard this before. If you have, then feel free to sort of like zone in and out. There's three forms of conflict resolution. Okay. Now, conflict is when party A don't agree with party B. Okay. So we'll say the hypothetical one, which as far as you guys are actually doing pretty well, but one of the other classes, we'll say that one of the other students isn't happy with the grade I gave them on one of their critical thinking exercises. So they're all bent out of shape at Border. Okay. So they email me and they say, I shouldn't have, this is unfair, I shouldn't have got this grade. And so we'll say that Border having a bad hair day goes, I'm sorry, but that's, according to what the criteria are, you didn't do it, and therefore, the grade holds. Now, if that person then goes, we'll say, to the dean and basically says, Bordner's a jerk and Bordner's picking on me and, so therefore I want you to fix this. So you now brought people in. So this conflict is starting to escalate. Now, there's basically 3 ways that you do this. And in fact, I think your student handbook actually has this stuff. I don't know, it's been a while since I looked at it. The first of those is what we call negotiation. Okay. Now, you have to remember, conflict means that 2 people don't agree about something. And generally, if they don't agree about something, they don't agree about it. And it's got to be at least some point pretty seriously, so there's some emotion involved. So people don't want to just say, okay, it's Friday, I give up, I'm going to drop it. It's just something that bugs them. So the most effective way to resolve conflict, remember that's the goal, is resolving it, is to basically make the 2 parties that don't agree to negotiate an end to this. So party, we'll say Bordner says, well, it was a crappy piece of paper. It was a bad job. And this person's saying, you're picking on me, it's not fair. So what they'd have to do between the 2 of them is basically then come up with some negotiated settlement. Now, what that means is Bordner's going to have to give up something, and the other person's going to have to give up something. We'll say, hypothetically, I go, well, okay, I didn't like the paper, but I don't know, I can't even think of a resolution of it because I don't do this, but we'll say that hypothetically, I'll let you rewrite the paper or give me another paper on the same topic that's better written and has more of this stuff in it, and then I'll rethink what I gauge on it. Don't get carried away because we're not doing that in my classes, but it's a hypothetical example. And that person, that means that I'm having to give up something. I'm going to have to put a lot more work into it and read the whole thing all over again that I didn't want to. Now, the student that's, was unhappy about their grade is like, well, they can either go no, okay, at which point then they're stuck with a grade they don't like about, which is what they're unhappy about in the first place. Or they can have to go to the effort to rewrite a paper with the hope of getting a better grade. So both parties have had to give up something, and this is negotiation. In negotiation, one party doesn't win and another party loses. In negotiation, both parties lose, and to a certain extent, both parties win, because of course the end result is resolution. Resolution doesn't involve winning and losing. Resolution involves ending the conflict. Negotiation, as you're probably well aware, if you think back in your own personal history, folks is really hard to do. If folks have gotten to the point where they're upset about something, it's very hard for them to be willing to back down and give up. So if they get a resolution, they want a result more than they want a resolution. So frequently what you find if negotiation won't happen is then mediation will be the next stage. Now you have to remember negotiation could happen if, for example, all my co-teachers said I was being hard on the student. And all of you, we'll say that all you guys are in another class with this student. And I'll usually get on the student's case and say, hey, that was a pretty shitty paper. So both parties can have pressure from outside, or other groups saying you should do something. But in negotiation, the 2 individuals that aren't happy are the ones that have to resolve the situation between them, because that's the only way you're going to get it resolved, is if the players who had issues resolve the issues. If that doesn't happen, then the next stage is what we call mediation. So mediation is basically the idea that negotiation hasn't worked. Person A isn't willing to shift enough, and person B isn't willing to shift enough to make resolution happen. So what you do is you bring in a mediator. Now, if this were a regular Zoom session, we can actually do this in class, but since you guys are watching this abstractly, ain't going to happen. And so mediation or mediator has a peculiar set of properties. One is if you're going to go shopping for a mediator, we'll say that person A and person B both want this conflict resolved, but they know they can't do it between them. They just can't figure out how to break that I won't do it to get resolution. So what they're going to have to decide upon mutually, both parties have to agree, is on someone who's going to be a mediator. Now, the definition of mediator is someone who's going to be an impartial third party, but their only job is to bring these 2 parties together to resolve the conflict. So a mediator does not make decisions. A judge in an American court is not a mediator. A judge in an American court is the third thing, that's arbitration or adjudication. A mediator would be someone that you see occasionally used in the United States, but we're not a society, sad to say, which uses mediation very much. Where basically both parties agree that this person will be fair. And so both parties present their point of view to this third party. And then what's going to happen is that the third party is going to think it over and they're going to say, well, what if you do this? What if you do that? And then also things like, can you see a little bit of their point of view? Can you see a little bit of their point of view? And what they're trying to do is bring them to kind of try to break that attitude apart. So these two parties that are disagreeing can get to the point where they can reach resolution. So the mediator helps people to negotiate. If you want to think of it that would be the easiest way to think of it. So mediation is a third party that has nothing to do with the final decision, except they encourage the parties how to get there. There are folks that do this. If you can figure out how to do it, you can get paid a lot of money. There's federal mediators and they make big bucks. So mediation is a very interesting area. I've only met 2 mediators in the sense of people that do this professionally. And to be honest, one didn't impress me very much, but the other was sort of amazing because I'd swear they could go into a thing where people are going to go after each other with axes in 5 minutes. And within 15 minutes, they'd have them thinking. Within half an hour, I think they would have got them. They wouldn't be necessarily put the axes down, but they'd really be thinking over what started this whole thing. Why was this such a good idea, and why is it maybe now it's actually such a bad idea? So really good mediators are very interesting people. If you ever get a chance to meet and talk to someone who is actually a professional mediator and they're actually good at it, take it, because they're really intriguing people to actually see, especially if you can see them in operation, which is really impressive. So mediation is I would argue that's almost a personality skill. But again, of course, it's going to be very specific to a particular culture. Different groups are going to have very different ideas of what mediation consists of, who can be a mediator, and how that's going to work, and what, how do you achieve mediation? Some societies, pretty much most stuff stops there. Other societies use, if the mediation fails, if the mediator finally walks out and says, you guys can just pick up your axes and go at it. I'm tired of talking to you guys. You aren't listening. So the mediator just gets the hell out of town. Then your last option is arbitration. Now, arbitration is the least effective form of conflict resolution. Because what both parties do is both parties go, and this would be the classic American court system. I do something and the prosecutor or the state of Hawaii says I did a bad thing or I did something wrong. So I and my attorney go in to a court with a judge sitting there in, in a little box somewhere. And the state and a prosecutor, the guy running the case for the state, comes in and they stand over there. So the two groups are here in the same courtroom together. And what they then do is they present what they think happened and how it should be fixed. And then it's then given to the judge, or if it's a jury trial, you give it to a group of people sitting over on the side. And they decide what the result's going to be. Okay. Now, at some point, there's an assumption of third-party fairness in all this, that it's not going to be arbitrary. But the reality is I think, especially in American society, there's generally a cynical attitude that judges and juries reflect a set of attitudes and values, which, in many cases mean that arbitration isn't very effective. If you're looking at the current riots and the whole Black Lives Matter situation, and both the riots of folks supporting Black Lives Matter and the counter riots of folks that are anti-Black Lives Matter, what you're seeing is the failure of arbitration. You have a jury trial, jury trials happen, the results given out, and riots start. Why? Because a group doesn't accept the result. That's not conflict resolution. If anything, it might make it worse than if you never had the arbitration or adjudication take place. So arbitration is the least effective. If you look at American society in the mainland right now in 2020, boy, you got that sucker right in your face. Negotiation is by far the most effective because the parties are actually having to resolve it. Mediation is a close second because in many cases that allows you to break through the attitudes that make resolution difficult. Arbitration means that no one's happy. If one side wins, they're going to say, well, yeah, okay, they were sentenced to something, but it should have been for more. The side that loses is going to say, oh, this is unfair. The judge was biased, or the jury was biased. They didn't like the color of my hair, whatever it is. So therefore, this was entirely a setup. It was a scam, and I don't think the decision was right. And I mean, you can hear this stuff going on every day as we speak. American society is really big on this. And we love arbitration in the United States, and it's an absolute failure. It does not work. And again, when you think about it, that's because you're talking about negative sanctions again. No one gets anything out of it. Well, I should say, in arbitration, invariably there's going to be a winner and a loser. And when you have winners and losers, that's generally not conflict resolution. So what's going to happen is that, you know, someone appeals the case. You go through the whole thing all over again. You know, I just, you just visualize it goes on and on and on. So you have to remember that conflict resolution, the reason for it, which is, of course, the reason, for example, for a judicial system, is to resolve conflict. And yet what happens very frequently is when you look at legal systems, judicial systems in many societies, their main function is to support or to basically structure norms. Their job is to punish people for doing things that break norms. They don't reward for positives. I've never seen a judge reward someone for good behavior. I don't think they can. It's not in the American legal system as far as I know. You'd have to ask Colin, maybe he'd know. But they're very good at punishing people for things they think they did wrong. And that's judicial or legal system in much of the modern world. It's basically a form of negative sanctions, and as we went over earlier, that tends to be sort of stunningly ineffective, because as long as you don't get caught, then you don't have any particular interest in following the norms. It's just a matter of whether you don't get caught or not. So it's not whether it was right or wrong, it's did you get caught? So group controls, we'll see that as we go into some societies. I can't think of any videos directly that tie into this, but if you think about a lot of the videos we had earlier, especially the ones on social media, in one way, shape, or form, I actually talked a lot about this. And you undoubtedly have a lot of your own life experience that ties to this. When we go into one society from one society to the other, we'll see in some societies, social control and norms are very, very structured and very constraining. Japanese society is oftentimes seen as a good stereotype of this. Other societies, in America side would sort of be a semi-good example of this, have very vague norms and very vague forms of sort of social control behavior, which is one reason why Japanese had a lot of very strange stereotypes about Americans, usually based on exaggerated views of the idea of lack of normative control. And Americans, if they think about it, tend to have very strong attitudes about Japanese society being super controlled or super normatively structured, where individuals have no freedom to do what they want to. At least that's the American stereotype. So with that, I think that pretty much finishes this one off. If I can find a particularly useful video, I'll give it to you, but yeah, I can't really think of one. There's a really good old Yanomami one of people chasing each other around with machetes, but that's actually, yeah, no, I just won't bother. Okay, so with that, enough on this one, and that was a fast module when you think about it. See you guys later.